Can everybody hear me? Am I on? Yes. Thank you, everyone. I have to say, I had a cultural experience in my last presentation. I couldn't tell whether you were into my talk or not, or you had the good Minnesotan blank face, and later on I had to ask about 10-15 people. It's like, was I totally off? Or they said, no, they're talking, it's good. So I wasn't hinting. Oh yes, okay, great. Well, I feel like it's been a great day already. It feels like we've been here for 2 days. Doesn't it feel that way? Yes. I have to say I am so excited for Bishop Steve's leadership here. I don't know where he is. I mean, yes. Can we have a round of applause? And I was with Raphael at the corner there, and we were just very touched by his sermon this morning in worship, and his commitment to the gospel, and just his passion towards this theme of food security. And I'm just so inspired and so excited to see what's going to happen in this Synod and the conversations and the vision that's put forward here. This time that we're going to have in the next 15-20 minutes, we'd really like to talk about some of the themes that we have been talking about throughout the day. We started off with a wonderful worship and concentrating on Matthew 25:35, that call to justice, that call to serve the least of these. And then we moved into a Bible study led by Raphael, where he was talking about the extreme relationality of the Trinity, that we were created in community for community, that relationships become the most essential part of mission, and that God is on a mission to restore and reconcile these relationships. And then we were introduced to this lens and method of accompaniment, of walking together because Christ has walked with us, and talking about the values that undergird this lens of accompaniment: mutuality, inclusivity, being vulnerable, thinking about sustainability, thinking about empowering one another, the values of accompaniment that hold the way that we do mission together. Raphael challenged us with the question of the defining question in mission today is, how do we engage the other? The defining question in mission is, how do we engage the other? Then we went into a conversation about talking about the glasses that we wear, the worldview that we have as we engage this other, whoever this other is, that cultural other, the other that comes in front of us in different generations, the political other. I always say the other can be your mother. And so there's so many ways that otherness comes into our lives. And we've talked about, what could be the responses that we can have that don't lead us to hostility towards the other, but to receive the other with hospitality. And that brings us to our conversation this afternoon. There's enormous, wonderful conversations that are happening around sustainable livelihoods and around hunger, and how do we address the root causes of hunger. So taking all these themes that were shared throughout the day, I would like to offer up a couple of thoughts for you as a synod, as you're having these conversations, to keep in mind. So again, I'd like us to given a little context to what hunger is looking like. I'm sure you know about these facts already. It's not just something that's happening over there, it's also happening in our midst. And when you see some of these stats, they're staggering. And I heard recently someone quote, if God was a gardener and we are the tillers, if this is the reality before it, what is it saying about us as a faith community? What is it saying that so many people go without food? What is it saying about us as tillers? And so, again, going back to these visuals that we were introduced to, the God story, my story, your story. as we are thinking about God's story, as we enter into these conversations about securing livelihoods, how do we understand God's story? A lot of times when we're having these conversations about hunger, I hear people talking about a world of scarcity, a creation of scarcity. I would like to offer up, as you're having this conversation, to know that the world and creation and how God created is enough for all. Bishop Steve lifted this up this morning. There is enough for all. It's actually scientifically proven that we have enough food in the world right now to feed people 3 times to 4 times over. There is enough in the world. And I think this is a really important theological understanding to have for us as a faith community, that God has created this world in abundance. There's enough for everybody's need, but there's not enough for everybody's greed. And so to hold on to that and to share that story of God as we go about having these conversations, and not create a culture of scarcity, and to understand God's incredible hospitality that he shows to creation as through this table that is in front of us. There's a little story from India that they will tell you always, that they say that every grain of rice has your name written on it. They say that every grain of rice, maybe for Minnesota it's wild rice, has a name written on it. And so it just reminds us that, there's a share of what we consume. So thinking about some of these values that undergird accompaniment, mutuality, vulnerability, and sustainability. These are important things as we talk about mission. These are usually not associated with mission. As we're talking about mutuality, what does it look like when we're having these conversations about people that are kind of separated from us? They're usually from a different socioeconomic background, but as Bishop Steve reminded us, they're in the midst of our community. How do we engage them in a mutual way? How do we understand hunger in a mutual way? How do we not speak condescendingly and also engage people condescendingly because they're different or they're from a different socioeconomic background? And that's sort of one of the values of mutuality. Are they part of our decision-making bodies? Are they around the table as we have these conversations? I will share a little bit more on vulnerability. So if we understand God's story like this, as God's story of abundance, that we have enough, and then as we're looking at the other, I think today's sermon was also pushing us one step further, not just talking about equality in relationship, but actually seeing Christ in the one that you serve. And when I do the greeting namaste, that's what it reminds me of, that I remind myself, whether it's easy conversation or hard conversation, that it is Jesus in front of me. That it is Jesus in front of me. And you don't have to be a minority or a majority for me to remind myself of that gospel truth. That it's not just a person, but actually Christ encountering us as we enter into service. Also, it reminds me of a story of Pastor Kelly, who serves in Redeemer Lutheran Church in North Minneapolis. He was talking to a group of young adults, and they were saying, what are some of the things you think about as you serve somebody? And he said, whenever I feed a child, I think about me feeding my inner child. And I thought it was a beautiful expression of mutuality to acknowledge that we all hunger for different things, and then there's that we see ourselves in poverty in different ways. My story of vulnerability. One of the most interesting core values of accompaniment is vulnerability. And as I've had conversations with different people across this church, I realized that vulnerability is not always a good word in your culture. That it kind of says it's a weakness, it's not something that you want to be. But interestingly enough, the cross invites us into being vulnerable. And usually power is associated with mission, but vulnerability isn't. And so what would it look like as a faith community for us to step out in vulnerability? And what does it mean in the context of hunger? What it means in a context of hunger is several things, and they are challenging. It would mean that for a minute we have to consider that our consumption is related to starvation in the world. It's being willing to consider that they are related. That our possessions might possess us. Our possessions might possess us. And that we're willing to connect the dots. That we're willing to connect that all of poverty and hunger is related to systems of production and distribution, that we're willing to take the time to see what systems are in play if we're going to engage this hard issue of food security. Eating sustainably is not only good for me, it's good for the world, and it's good for the other. So I hope that we are not seduced by the tip of the iceberg. That we can approach this theme of food security from the perspective of a tip of the iceberg, or that we're willing to do some deep diving. I don't know whether you've been introduced to these cartoons. They've been here forever in the Lutheran community. It's by Daniel Erlander. And I love this story about manna and mercy. And it just has some great teachings as we have this conversation. And I love this little cartoon. You know, God taking the Israelites into the wilderness to do some schooling. And here's a couple of things that we can learn from the journey. The first thing is that manna comes from God, and God is the provider, and God continues to provide, that there is enough for all. It's a world of abundance and not scarcity. But then the people, when they try to hoard, so in God's economy, no hoarding, because hoarding stinks. And the thing that we as community of faith, with our good Protestant work ethic, forget that this work is also about taking rest, that the seventh day is Sabbath, that it is for rest. Then that is part of this hard work of justice and standing in solidarity with the least of these, that Sabbath is part of that understanding. And then this message, remember now, take only your portion, share with others, wash your hands, clean up after yourselves, and eat to live. Don't live to eat. As ELCA World Hunger, and as we as church-wide and synods and congregations engage in this conversation about food security and world hunger, we hope that all these things are part of the conversation. Not just giving, but the way that we understand God's story, the way that we understand our story, and then the way that we understand the other story, that it is accompaniment, that accompaniment is willing to be vulnerable. Accompaniment is willing to look at these values. Accompaniment is willing to look at the systems, the distribution, the possessions, the wealth, the poverty, and we're willing to have this conversation as we engage in mission. So thank you again for this time, and I hope that there's many, many more conversations and visions that will come out of this work. Namaste.